Hello, my babies. This is Mrs. Saunders, and I am here to talk about task 6-2, which is the second reading assignment in the DBQ on Robert Frost called Meaning and Metaphor. What is Frost saying? The article that we're going to talk about today is the introductory piece to the DBQ, and it gives you some background information about who Frost is and what kind of stuff he wrote. There is an assignment posted in Google Classroom for you to do once we're done discussing this today. It is mostly reading comprehension, which is basically, did you read it? And can you pull facts out of it? Most of what I'm going to talk about is going to be analysis and making connections to the text and what you can get out of a basic one-page article like this, because there's a lot more in it than if you just read it one time on your own. Now, if you haven't read this page, I'm going to need you to pause me here in a second and read it on your own. I would recommend taking notes. If you're taking notes on notebook paper, that's fine. If you're able to print out this page and write on it, that's fine too. I'm a hands-on kind of girl, so I like having the paper in my hand so that I can write on it. But not everybody works like that. Some of you may be able to write on the screen with a stylus, like if you're on a tablet, and that's fine too. So if you haven't read it yet, pause now, read it, and then come back. Okay, I'm going to assume that you've read it and that you are back now, having taken some notes and read the article. A couple of things I want to start off by saying is the first, our goal as educators isn't that at your 20-year class reunion, you're going to remember everything that you read today about Robert Frost. What our goal is that maybe you remember there's this guy named Robert Frost who wrote some really great poetry. What we want you to be able to do is to read for information and to solve problems and be able to process information. So, even if you don't remember the things that Robert Frost wrote, hopefully you will remember that you have the ability to read things and put things together, and you'll remember that Robert Frost was an American poet and he wrote some cool stuff. Now, I also recognize that as a white teacher who has primarily minority students, one of the questions that I always try to answer is, why are we reading yet another dead white guy? Because, look at this picture. He's a white guy and he's dead. We're reading Robert Frost as another dead white guy because he was a brilliant poet. And the things that he wrote about are things that we can all relate to, even if looking at him and looking at his poetry on the surface, you wouldn't think that. Just bear with me. I promise I can prove what I just said. So it's my belief as a teacher and as a person that we can learn from just about everybody we come in contact with. And Frost's views on the world, I think, are like a lot of ours. We want people to see us for more than just what's on the surface. We want people to understand that where we come from and what we come from are a part of who we are, but they don't necessarily make up our whole person. So that's what we're going to start with. I'm one of those people, when I read something, I tend to write on it a lot. So what I have on the screen here is the clean copy and the written on copy. So if you were reading this in class and we were sitting in class, this is the sort of thing that I would want you to do. I want you to mark things. I want you to underline things. I want you to make notes in the margins. Because what that shows me is that you're not just reading, but that you are interacting with it and you're trying to figure it out and you're doing things with the text, not just scanning over it and trying to get done so you can put your head down for 5 minutes. All right, so what I tend to do is I tell people to color code their work. So there were 6 things that I marked in this text, and they are color coded. And we're actually going to start with the last one, since I brought up the personal connections to Robert Frost. When you read the article, you find out that he had a really rough start. His dad died when he was 11. He never finished college. He got married and had 6 kids. 4 of them died, and his wife suffered from depression. Now, personally, I know the statistics about kids today in broken homes and absentee parents. So I know that there's a good percentage of you that have a parent that you're not as closely connected to as you could be. I also know that mental health statistics being what they are, that most of us have a connection to somebody who has a mental illness. And because of that, we can all, on some level, relate to Robert Frost. We have all gone through some of this stuff. I mean, in my own life, I have an aunt who committed suicide. I have another aunt who, well, my great aunt, who was schizophrenic. So I know what it's like to have mental health issues in my family. So just because he's an old white guy doesn't mean that he hasn't experienced some of the same things that we're all experiencing today. Another thing that we have in common with him is if you look in the second paragraph, it talks about Frost was living in a world facing its own troubles. There was World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, and the Cold War. So if you look, he was born in 1874. So when World War I started, he was, 70s, 80s, 90s, 10s, 20s. He was in his 40s when World War I started. So his adult life, as his own children were coming of age and beginning their adult lives, was in this time period when there was one thing after another that was going wrong. And that's sort of the experience that we're having now. We're all in this crazy pandemic mode. So again, we can kind of look at the experiences that he had and understand a little bit about where he's coming from. And then further on in the article, he says, Frost once told an interviewer, "I don't like to write anything I don't see." Pretty much any piece of advice that people give to students who are learning to become better writers is to write what you know. So Frost came out and said, "I don't like to write it if I haven't seen it." So he comes out and tells us that he only writes things that he has personal experience with, which is a really good thing for us as readers, because even though he uses a lot of metaphors, we can figure out what he's really talking about because we know that he writes about his own experiences. All right, last thing with the connections. You come down the second column. On the side on the right, it says, so was Frost writing about the things he saw with his eyes or the connections he made in the mind? The answer is both. Poems often carry a literal meaning as well as a metaphorical meaning. Here's the thing. We as people are more than what people see on the surface. We have thoughts and feelings and experiences that have shaped us and made us who we are and made us the decision makers that we are. But you can't see that on the surface. That's the difference between literal meaning and metaphorical meaning. Literal meaning is what you can see on the page without doing any digging, without looking and reading between the lines, without trying to figure out what he's, quote, really trying to say. Looking at somebody and judging that book by its cover, that's literal meaning. Metaphorical meaning goes deeper, and it looks at the things that have shaped us as people. But in written terms, we're looking at how he's using language to give us a deeper insight into what he's explaining, what he's thinking, what he's feeling. So Frost has that same desire that we do as people. He wants people to see him and to see his work as more than just what's on the surface. All right, y'all still with me? So those are the connections that you can make when you read this article. All right, so we're going to look at what the main idea of this whole piece is. The interesting things like with these articles that they assign students to read is that somewhere in that article will be a sentence where it comes out and tells you a straight up summary of what it is they want you to get out of the piece that you're reading. And what I have highlighted in green is that straight up summary. In other words, by using metaphor, Frost makes comparisons between the world of nature and the world of mankind. So what he does is he describes something that's happening in nature and uses that to help us understand something that's going on inside us as individuals or inside us as a community or a nation. That single sentence summary, if you were writing your own essay, would be called a thesis. This, what I've highlighted in green, is the thesis of the article. Okay? Excuse me. So we've done purple and we've done green. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, I've highlighted some words in blue. Those are the literary terms that you're going to need to know in order to be able to function in this unit. Epitaph, images, metaphor, extended metaphor, literal meaning, and then I went ahead and highlighted metaphorical meaning because without metaphorical meaning, then literary meaning doesn't really make sense. So those are the 6 terms that you need to be able to understand. If you're looking at context clues, you can look at the word epitaph when it talks about how some people think stopping by the woods on a snowy evening is him contemplating suicide. And we'll come back to that in another lesson when we actually read that particular poem. A line from another poem was taken as Frost's epitaph and reveals a man of torn emotions. I had a lover's quarrel with the world. Now, this is a perfect example of a metaphor. He wasn't in love with the world. None of us are the world's lovers. So to say you had a lover quarrel with the world doesn't really make any sense if you look at it literally, the literal meaning. Okay? A lover's quarrel is kind of like a petty argument that people in a relationship will sometimes have that gets blown out of proportion. And then when the dust settles, both people are like, oh, well, yeah, we both screwed up. It's okay. So lover's quarrel with the world is a metaphor for how he felt about the world. He felt like they disagreed about a lot of stuff, but in the end, they got along okay. Okay? Now, an epitaph is that thing that people put on their tombstones, like their final quote. So this, I had a lover's quarrel with the world, is what is on his tombstone. And for all of my fabulous listeners, if you can post a picture of Robert Frost's actual headstone in Google Classroom in the discussion thread for assignment 6-2, I will give you extra credit points. All right. I apologize for the noise in the background. I'm recording this while my kids are helping my husband clean. We're getting our carpet cleaned today. So anyway, that's a side note. All right. So the next words that we have are metaphor and extended metaphor. A metaphor, like we just read, is a way of saying something that isn't literally true. Okay? He didn't have a lover's quarrel with the world. He had a lot of little disagreements with the world, but in the end, decided that the world was okay and the world decided he was okay. And with assignment 6-1, you know that getting stabbed in the back is also a metaphor. An extended metaphor is when someone takes a comparison and spreads it all the way through their piece of writing. We'll get into an extended metaphor in a future assignment, so don't freak out if you don't understand what it is right now. And we already talked about literal meaning and metaphorical meaning. All right, so that covers all of the blue stuff. Now, when we read any sort of piece of informational writing, there's always going to be something that ties it up that serves as its conclusion. One of the primary ways that persuasive and argumentative writing ends is with a call to action. So most of this piece, while it's informational, leads up to the call to action, which is right here in yellow. And essentially, it gives you two tasks, two jobs. First, what's the literal meaning of the poem? What do the words on the page say is happening? Then you have to read between the lines and do that whole figuring out what the poem's really about. And we're going to do that with the next assignment that has to do with cows and apples, which sounds a little weird, but I promise it's not completely strange. So that's your call to action. And then the main question that we're answering in this whole DBQ is down here in pink. In doing so, you'll answer the question, meaning and metaphor, what is Frost saying? So that gives you a hint at the essay that you're going to have to write. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is the stuff I have up here in the color orange. And this is a quick writing lesson. A lot of students, when they write, their biggest problem is that they don't support what it is they're trying to say. They'll say a piece of information and then they'll move on to the next thing. What we need you to do as teachers and as readers is to support your arguments. So if you look at this first sentence, Robert Frost was one of America's most distinguished poets, but his beginnings were not easy. Now, a lot of you as writers will just stop there because you've said what you want to say. Okay, he was a great poet, but his early life was kind of tough. If we stop there, there's no proof. So as a writer, you're going to want to continue and give us the details and prove to us that his beginnings were not easy. So if you read the rest of the paragraph, the things that I've sort of highlighted in orange, you're going to see his beginnings weren't easy because his father died. Beginnings weren't easy because he left college without his degree. Beginnings weren't easy because he tried to be a farmer for 10 years. It wasn't easy because 2 of his 6 kids died as children, and then 2 more of them died as adults, and one of them committed suicide. And his life wasn't easy again because his wife battled for depression. Now, the topic sentence of this paragraph says his beginnings weren't easy. Most of us would think that beginnings would just apply to childhood, right? Right? Yeah. But what this article is talking about is his beginnings as a poet. Okay. And then the second paragraph talks about, even though those years were personally difficult, everybody else in the world was facing big group problems. Everybody was affected by World War I and the Great Depression and World War II. Most of the people on the planet were affected by the Cold War. So this is talking about like his beginnings as a writer and as somebody who was documenting life in this time period. Now that we've read all of this, if you have questions, you know how to get in touch with me, and make sure that you get on Google Classroom and do the quiz. And don't forget about the extra credit opportunity that I mentioned in our conversation today. And I will see you when we do lesson 6-3. Thanks for watching.